As the great niece of Hugh Ramsay, I grew up with his works and learned of his genius and his extraordinary success and the tragedy of his short life. When he died in 1906, his mentor, John Longstaff, wrote a touching letter to his brother, Dr. John Ramsay, in Launceston, extolling the affection and admiration that he had for him. He wrote, "Do not let his works get scattered about. I would suggest that everything he's done be kept in the family as far as possible, so that there can be an exhibition of his work at some future time. At least you should know where to put your hands on any of his work." Such was the veneration for Hugh within the family, that since his death, virtually all his works have been treasured and housed. Except the odd commission or works given or sold during his lifetime, virtually none has been sold on the open market, which makes them rare and highly collectible today, not to mention forgeable. There are rare exceptions. At his memorial exhibition in 1918, his father sold works to raise funds to set up the Hugh Ramsay Prize at the National Gallery School. Over the years, his works have been gifted to various institutions around Australia, notably, as Daniel mentioned, in 1947, when John and Janet Wicking, under the guidance of Daryl Lindsay, who was the director of the NGV at the time, generously gave 16 works to schools and institutions. I must add that they were extremely disappointed to learn that some of these works had later been sold or neglected. The Wickings were very touchy about Ramsay. Anyway, it's a legacy that continues, and I'm proud to be part of it today. My closest connection with Ramsay began when I was about 6. I was given his Winsor & Newton paint box, and shortly after, performed my first act in rescuing his paintings. Walking the family dog in the hills of Upper Beaconsfield one morning, I noticed it was preoccupied with something that looked like a rag. When I extracted it from its mouth and presented it to the breakfast table, Mother exclaimed, "Oh my God, that's a portrait of Dame Nellie Melba by Hugh Ramsay." Today, this painting hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. Since then, I've rescued many a Ramsay from broom cupboards to bushfires. As a young 16-year-old student in the Fine Arts Department at Melbourne University in 1962, Professor Joseph Burke cast a genial eye upon me, inviting me for tea in my first week. At the time, I had no idea of his particular interest in Ramsay, but he did mention he'd recently visited my grandmother, Lady Ramsay, in Launceston. I also met Patricia Goulet, whose MA thesis on Ramsay Joe Burke was supervising at the time. Anyway, as we all did in the 60s, I traveled the world working at Expo 67 in Montreal, in London, studying at the Sorbonne in Paris, then Florence, working at the print room at the Uffizi Gallery, and archaeological digging at Herod's Temple in Jerusalem. Life was filled with rich adventures abroad. In 1978, on a return visit to Australia, I went with Mother to Gran's house in Launceston shortly after she died. While sorting out her affairs, we came upon her box couch in her bedroom. This had been a makeshift bed for me since I'd been a tiny tot. Within this box couch, we discovered a Pandora's box of Hugh Ramsay memorabilia, pages of his beautifully illustrated letters dating from the 1890s, describing his gallery school days, as well as his life in Paris, his salon success, and best of all, his meeting with Melba in Paris, and then his later account of how she wined and dined him at her London house, where she commissioned him to paint a portrait in 1902. Can you imagine that from a tender age, I'd been put to sleep countless times over this treasure box of Hugh Ramsay memorabilia? My first thought was to contact Patricia Goulet and offer her this Ramsay gold mine in the hope that she might think to incorporate it in a book. Sadly, I learned she had died only months before, so the way was wide open for me to write it myself. One of the things you do when you're writing about a dead person is to visit their grave. I arrived at St Kilda Cemetery at 9 a.m. and felt sure that by 9:30 I would be standing in front of his tomb. This is one of the largest graveyards in Australia, and after half an hour I must have covered about 1%. However, precisely at 9:30 I stopped still and gazed at the modern grave before me. I must say I was disappointed not to be standing in front of an old tomb, but guess whose grave it was? Patricia Goulet. I had no idea she was even buried there. Her thesis, particularly her catalogue, was invaluable for my early research. Many other extraordinary coincidences have happened since I started pursuing Ramsay's life. In 1980, at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, I approached the director of the periodical department requesting articles on the Salon of 1902. En passant, I mentioned Hugh Ramsay's name. Imagine my surprise when he replied, "Oh, the young Australian artist who exhibited 4 paintings that year." I said, "Mon Dieu, comment?" I said, "Nobody in Australia could tell me that." And he said that for the last, Mr. Jean Vatelet, that is, by extraordinary luck, had spent the last 4 years researching the entire salon, going back to the 1700s or whenever it started. How he remembered Ramsay's name was a miracle, and it saved me 6 months' research. This was not the first time I felt somehow destined to be Ramsay's biographer. When I heard of Patricia Goulet's death in 1978, I cancelled all plans of returning to Europe and found a job with the Hawthorne City Art Gallery. As luck would have it, my encounters there were extraordinarily fruitful. Fred Williams and Ian Armstrong were regular visitors. They'd both become Ramsay devotees since 1943, when Daryl Lindsay staged the first Hugh Ramsay retrospective at the National Gallery of Victoria. Their appreciation of Ramsay's work gave me much insight into his technique and skill. Equally serendipitous was my meeting with Mary Eagle, the Age art critic at the time. Mary's extraordinary perception and vast knowledge helped get my manuscript to a point where it was publishable, and our ongoing friendship has taken us to many places in Europe, South America, and around Australia. 10 long years in the making, Hugh Ramsay's life and work was finally published in 1988. It led to a revival of interest in the artist and to the Hugh Ramsay retrospective at the NGV in 1993, 50 years after the last retrospective. Now, so it's time for another Ramsay exhibition. And I'm sure Daniel Thomas won't mind me quoting him. I think, Daniel, you said, all significant dead artists should be exhibited every 20 years. Good on you, Daniel. Daniel, of course, gave me great encouragement in my early writing, especially when he came to Melbourne to read Hugh's letters and to visit houses where his works hung. We also shared an uncanny experience at the opening of the NGA in 1982. Daniel had just read my manuscript and said, "What a pity you haven't got more detail on Ramsay's fiancée, Lieschen Müller." For years I had tried to track her down, but standing in front of the Italian dwarf, which my mother had recently donated, a young lady piped up, "If Hugh Ramsay had married, he would have been my uncle." From this encounter with Lieschen's niece, I learned much of her own tragic life. So who is this brilliant young man who's preoccupied much of my life for all these years? Hugh Ramsay was born in Glasgow, 1877, and sailed with his family to Australia the following year. His father, John, was a man of the Congregational Church and was often seen on a soapbox on the banks of the Yarra, where he took on firebrands, including the young Irishman Daniel Mannix, future Archbishop of Melbourne. Trained as a carpenter, John was also entrepreneurial and made money from importing Bibles, watches, and gemstones. As well, he dabbled in real estate. In the 1880s land boom, he accumulated sufficient funds to build a grand house, Clydebank, in Essendon. Thrice blessed by Roman Catholic archbishops, including Mannix, today Clydebank is owned by the Ave Maria School and is classified by the National Trust. This family home was an important backdrop to Hugh's short life. Here he set up his first studio, painted many significant portraits, and died within its walls. Ramsay's mother, Margaret, was a devoted wife. Despite suffering from poor health, she was pregnant for nearly 20 years and gave birth to 9 surviving children. Her death in 1896 caused much pain to the family, but 2 years later, John Ramsay married her maiden sister, Janet, who'd come to Australia to help with the family. About this time, Ramsay became involved with the poetry of John Keats, whose life was to share much in common with his own. He wrote, "Keats is glorious, he should have been a painter," little realizing that one day Sir Robert Menzies, Prime Minister of Australia, would call Ramsay the Keats of the brush. Hugh was placed in the middle of the family. Will, Jim, John, Hugh, Nell, Madge, Jessie, and Tom. Here we have the old man with his boys. Anyway, he was close to them all, and they were the recipients of many his funny letters, and the subjects of many portraits. There's his dear sister Jessie. Note the similarity to Whistler's White Girl. From an early age, Hugh showed talent in both art and music, but he chose to become an artist, a career his father described as not only a precarious means of livelihood, but of a distinctly questionable nature. Dux of Essendon Grammar and choirmaster at the local church, he entered the National Gallery School in 1893, aged 16. A natural draftsman, his drawing from this period won him many prizes, escalating him into the painting school in record time. Under his painting teacher, Bernard Hall, he was introduced to the tonal works of Velasquez and his 19th century follower, Whistler. Following these examples, he restricted his backgrounds to neutral olive greens and limited his palette to a harmonious range of subdued silver greys. His student works reveal the subtleties of tonal painting, producing a soft, luminous quality of color, notably in his treatment of flesh. His work became distinguished by a sensitive portrayal of character, not simply in the face, but through the expressiveness of hands and body as well, as a mature grasp of spatial depth and composition. Prolific, competent, diligent, and mature beyond his years, his prize-winning record was second to none. This is the prize-winning one. My brother objected to this being put on the invitation for the National Gallery Victoria's exhibition in '92. It's the most beautiful painting. It was also stolen from the NGV about the same time it was returned as the Picasso. George Bell recalled he was that very rare phenomenon, a born painter. To us, his fellow students, his extreme facility was a continual source of amazement. He had a ready solution for every problem that arose. His exceptionally fast painting technique attracted comments like, "Brilliant, sure, dexterous, never saw anyone produce with such rapidity." But it also gave rise to murmurs of fatal facility. Meanwhile, he'd fallen in love with a young German girl, Lieschen Müller, who'd come to his studio to take painting lessons. From a cultured European background, Lieschen was high-spirited and shared his love for poetry, art, and music. Her mother was of noble birth and her father a scholar, who tutored the Pinchov daughters. Karl Pinchov was the Austro-Hungarian consul in Melbourne. Lieschen Müller's brother, Fritz Müller, was recognized as an accomplished pianist when at the age of 8 he accompanied Madame Elise Pinchov, the first singing teacher at the Melbourne Conservatorium, the woman who was responsible for introducing a young soprano to her former teacher in Paris, Mathilde Marchesi, who actually named this young Helen Mitchell Madame Melba. So the connection with Melba goes right through. Because of his friendship with Lieschen, Ramsay was invited to many musical events at the splendid Pinchov House in Studley Park, where he rubbed shoulders with well-known musicians and artists of the day. During his courtship with Lieschen, Hugh embarked on his most ambitious canvas to date. Constellation was inspired by Keats' poem Hyperion, which he was writing when he first met Fanny Brawne. Lieschen posed for the goddess Moneta, and George Bell was the model for Saturn. Keats had spent 3 years laboring over Hyperion before finally rewriting it. Referring to it as my Keats picture, Ramsay was to rework this painting for over 2 years. Although predicted to win the 1899 travelling scholarship, Ramsay was disappointed to be placed second to Max Meldrum. But like most of his contemporaries, he was determined to study abroad. His mentor, John Longstaff, the anthropologist Baldwin Spencer, plus other supporters, organized an art union. With funds raised from the sale of some of his paintings, he sailed for Europe in September 1900. He was farewelled on the docks by 16-year-old Lieschen, to whom he had become unofficially engaged. On board the SS Persic, Ramsay had the good fortune to meet with George and Amy Lambert, who became firm friends. During the 8-week voyage, he continued to work on Constellation, which became a springboard for discussion with Lambert, particularly about the difficulties of working on a canvas over a period of time. After visiting relatives in Scotland and the Lamberts in London, Ramsay arrived in Paris in January 1901, just before Queen Victoria's funeral and shortly after the conclusion of the Exposition Universelle. He accepted the offer of former gallery school student James MacDonald to share his studio Montparnasse on the edge of the Latin Quarter. Since most of the known ateliers were nearby, the area was a mecca for foreign students drawn to Paris at the time. Artists in the same building included Ambrose Patterson, a former gallery school student, and Americans Frederick Frazicki and Henry Osawa Tanner. The Lamberts arrived soon after and joined the small fraternity. Studios at 51 Boulevard Saint-Jacques were typical artist lodgings, a number of rooms on top of a dilapidated timber building. The rent was cheap, and despite being cold and drafty, the light was good. The large area served as a sitting room, bedroom, kitchen, and studio, where they ate, slept, entertained, and worked. And the potbelly stove, of course, was probably one of the most important pieces of furniture during those harsh winters in Paris. Ramsay enrolled at the Academy Colarossi, where Lambert joined him shortly after. Together they'd spent time absorbing the cultural richness of the city, frequenting galleries, especially the Louvre, to study the old masters, notably Velázquez. I just wanted to draw attention to the length of his fingers. There are absolutely no exaggeration. And also to note that on his left hand, third finger, he's wearing an engagement ring. Under the freedom of instruction at the Colarossi and painting from dawn till dark, Ramsay's work improved. Within 3 months, his portrait of James MacDonald was accepted by the Old Salon. James is smoking a cigarette. Ramsay was beginning to have an influence on his friends, notably Patterson and Lambert. Amy wrote, Lambert was one of his most enthusiastic admirers and set himself to build up his own technique on similar lines. Their friendship was invaluable to them both. Their arguments and their companionship in studio and galleries most stimulating. The long strides Ramsay made by contrast threw all Lambert's work into the shade. No aspect of Ramsay's oeuvre better demonstrates the solitary late-night dedication to his craft than the number of self-portraits he painted in Paris. Like many artists, he found himself a convenient subject to experiment with. No models' fees to pay, no appointments to keep, no compromises to please or flatter the sitter. Free to explore issues such as the shape and scale of canvas, composition, lighting, dress, pose, and facial expression, they throw valuable light on the development of his style and inventive skills, not to mention his critical self-perception. Some of his self-portraits show indebtedness to Van Dyck, Whistler, or Manet, but mostly Velázquez predominates. Whether the inspired grand tradition dressed up in white jacket, hand on hip, head held high, or in informal poses wearing baggy trousers and rolled up shirt sleeves as a painter in action. His self-depictions were literal interpretations of how he saw himself, but in the more subtle elements of composition, pose, lighting, and tonal values, Velázquez predominated. His ability to capture likeness was never in question, but in most of his portraits he shows uncompromising candor. Many, unflattering to his youthful good looks, portray him as years older than 24. Even here, you can see his hair's receding. Oh no, he wasn't kind to himself. Anyway, often with a hard, lean face, hair thinning, receding, and deep furrow in his brow, but sometimes he was frivolous, interpreting his brush as a cigarette or placing a trilby hat on his head to give a jaunty effect. It wasn't only Ramsay's work that benefited from these self-portraits. Lambert and Patterson often watched him working and discussed his technique. Patterson was also the subject of several Ramsay paintings. Nothing could have convinced them more about his superior skills than the acceptance of 4 of his paintings at the New Salon in April 1902, and all hung on the line, that means at eye level. This was an exceptional honor for a 24-year-old exhibiting for the first time, let alone for an Australian. They were Jeanne, who's going to be spoken about, A Lady of Cleveland, and Books, Mask, and Lamp. Salon's success led to commissions. None could have been more important to his career than his meeting with Nellie Melba, an introduction arranged by his grateful disciple Ambrose Patterson. The grand diva arrived in all her finery at the humble artist's studio, where despite his being flabbergasted, as he said, he managed to do a quick oil sketch in half an hour. Remember my dog walk in Upper Beaconsfield? This is the rag that the dog had in its mouth in Upper Beaconsfield. The following month, Ramsay arrived in London, where he stayed with his old mentor, John Longstaff. True to her word, Melba wined and dined him in style, and he was introduced to influential contacts in Edwardian society. Fortunately, Melba's busy schedule gave him time to visit the current Royal Academy exhibition, where Rupert Bunny's recent portrait of Melba was hanging, alongside John Singer Sargent's works. He dismissed Bunny's portrait as, this is from a 24-year-old talking about a known 37-year-old, a nice artistic thing, fine in scheme, and a good decoration, but it isn't by any means a portrait. Of course, portraiture's a bit out of Bunny's charming realm. What portraiture meant to Ramsay at the time was demonstrated by his immediate response to Sargent. Sargent dominates the Academy and convinces me what a really great painter he is. He uses the beauty of light and colour, the lovely truth of atmospheric envelopment. Seeing his canvas at the proper distance, the truth in them is absolutely convincing. The impact of Sargent's style came at a time when Ramsay was most vulnerable. Inspired by his commission to paint Melba, thrust into the company of celebrities with hopes of further portraits, he was bound to be impressed by the citoyenne of Edwardian society portraiture. Interesting, their styles had derived from Velázquez independently. In Sargent, Ramsay recognized a masterly version of his own technique. They both worked quickly and deftly with fully loaded brush. Ramsay also recognized a technical mastery of certain pictorial details which are important to him as well. Honest yet sensitive portrayal of character, striking poses, interest in texture and dramatic count in color and highlights, and an ability to compose on a grand scale. On the brink of what seemed like major international success, equipped with Sargent as a role model, Ramsay embarked on Melba's portrait. Suddenly his health failed. Diagnosed with incipient tuberculosis, probably caused by 2 harsh winters in Paris, where he'd overworked and neglected his diet. He was forced to return to Melbourne. Melba lent him £60 for his return passage. Back home at Clydebank, reunited with Leishan family and friends, his spirits lifted and his strength temporarily returned. Despite doctors' warnings not to paint, he was not a good patient. Incapable of resting for long and needing to paint, he suffered continual relapses. Inspired by his recent contact with Sargent, he painted with a new vigor and boldness of style. From his sickbed, he painted some of his largest and best works. We've seen Madge. In December 1902, a month after Ramsay's return, Melba made her first homecoming to her native city after 16 years, causing celebration on a royal scale. In spite of her demanding concert tour and social commitments, she found time to mount an exhibition of Ramsay's works at her house, Mayura. This was the only solo show of Ramsay's work in his lifetime. It drew large crowds, mostly sticky beaks, wanting to see inside the Grand Diva's house, but it received favorable reviews and the art community hailed him. 6 of his works were hung at the NGV, and Melba commissioned him to paint her father, David Mitchell, and niece, Nellie Patterson. Bernard Hall, who later claimed him as one of his most brilliant students during his 43 years at the Gallery School, placed him on the judging panel, along with Nerley and Walter Withers, who were at least 20 years older. This was for the annual student exhibition and judging of the travelling scholarship. His old mate, George Bell, was still a student there. Ramsay wrote, "It's so rum to me to be so recently a student here and now to be treated on terms of equality by all the powers that be, to see the hordes of students waiting outside the doors, to hear the decision of the Scholl. I could see their white faces and thought it wasn't so long ago that my face was one of the white ones." In 1903, Leishan's mother died of cancer. Her father went into a decline and died shortly after. Poor Leishan, she not only nursed her sick mother and then her grieving father, was now faced with the responsibility of the care of her 2 younger brothers. She was just 19. Due to the infectious nature of Ramsay's disease, they were forced to separate, a devastating blow for both. In spite of doctors' warnings and a promise never again to overwork, Ramsay turned to the brush for solace. From his sickbed, he chose to paint the largest canvas he'd ever attempted. Not only was the subject of a horse foreign to his brush, but flying in the face of medical advice, he chose to paint his doctor's own son as the principal subject. When equestrian portrait was exhibited at the VAS, it was the talking point of the show. His last canvases painted at Clydebank are of the women closest to him. To this period belong the sad faces of Leishan in Lady with the Fan, and his sisters Jessie, Madge and Nell in The Sisters, subsequently claimed as his masterpiece or swan song. Suffering relapses in 1901 and 05, he was sent to stay at Barnawatha near Albury on the New South Wales border. The Mackenzies had already nursed a tubercular case and knew the rules. He slept in a tent and his eating utensils were boiled and kept separately. Despite his illness, he was remembered as cheerful, stoic and helpful on the farm. In his spare time, he's continued to sketch, but he's now lost his strength and energy. No longer able to work on a large scale, to this period belong his small farmyard sketches and the odd commission arranged by his former teacher, Bernard Hall, who continued to keep in touch. Once again, as in Paris, isolated from his loved ones, Ramsay again became preoccupied with his own features. Unlike the bold Parisian experimental works, his later self-portraits reveal his introspection about his failing health. With clinical analysis, he explored his gaunt and hollow cheekbones, the sunken, haunted eyes, the pallor of his skin, and his listless body. Further sadness darkened his life in October 1905, when his younger sister, Jessie, was diagnosed with typhoid. She was sent to Barnawater to join him. The tender moments they shared are captured in his many sketches of her. Ramsay died on the 5th of March, 1906, in the arms of his sister Jessie. Jessie contracted his disease and died 4 years later, aged 22. They're buried together at the St. Kilda Cemetery.